Okay, let's bring in the panel. From New York, we have Jim Anderson. He's the CEO of Social Flow, a company that helps media organizations distribute its social content online. In Berlin, we have Joanna Bryson, Professor of Technology and Ethics at the Hertie School of Governance. And here in Doha, we have Mark Owen Jones, a professor who specializes in social media and the digital humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Welcome to you all. Jim Anderson in New York, can I come to you first? So Apple's going to give us, you, me, everyone else around the world, 1 billion of us, more privacy. What's the problem?
Well, there's no problem with that, and Apple definitely has a strong hand here. When you go to consumers and you say, would you like more privacy, most of them are going to say yes. I saw one statistic saying 3 out of 4 people would say yes and don't track me. I think that's actually low. I think it's probably more like 9 out of 10 people. The problem is what Facebook is trying to say is, wow, you know, that's really going to impact not just Facebook, it's going to impact the small businesses who are the advertisers on Facebook. And they have 10 to 12 million small business advertisers. And that's really Facebook's message is what you think is going to protect your privacy, and it will, and maybe harm Facebook, and it will, is also going to harm those small businesses who reach customers by advertising on Facebook.
Mark Owen Jones here in Doha, but the reality is that the people that run these massive 4 global tech companies, Google, Amazon, Apple and Facebook, they do collect an astonishing amount of data every time we hit click on something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's, as Jim said, these privacy changes by Apple are going to be welcome. There's a certain irony here to what Facebook are doing because of recent scandals in the past few years. For example, Cambridge Analytica, where it's come to light of how much data is being collected by these companies and how it might be misused. That's actually raised people's awareness of privacy issues. So the fact that Facebook now are criticizing Apple for offering this privacy option is a tad ironic. But Facebook, in a way, are a victim of their own success in this regard.
Joanna Bryson in Berlin. Is Apple kind of, in one sense or at one level, preaching to the converted? There was a study in 2018 done by Pew in America, the Pew Research Group. The vast majority of us don't like the feeling that we are, in effect, being stalked by whichever website we go to.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely Apple has the stronger hands now. I mean, it has $2 trillion market cap. So it's decided to play the public this direction. It is its brand. And I've heard that, you know, also from NATO, that they have the brand that people trust for their cybersecurity. So it's really interesting to me is that Facebook is trying to run interference against the new governance, at the same time claiming that it's in favor of governance and regulation, but trying very hard to convince people, for example, that consumers want to see more targeted advertisements, or in this case, that they're more concerned about the small and medium enterprises, which of course the European Commission believes is an extremely important part of the European economy and ecosystem. So that they're trying to claim that those are the people that will be benefiting or be harmed. As well, I suppose there are some proportion of small companies that will be, as well as, say, large political campaigns and things like that.
OK, Joanna, can I just ask you to put on your ethics professor's head for a second? Is the idea of privacy enshrined or codified any place as a human right?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a really great question. Which means I'm not entirely sure of the answer, although I should know this from the fundamental rights through the European Union, not the European Union, sorry, the United Nations. But what the European Union has decided with the GDPR is that if you have the capacity to know about the behavior of the citizens of the EU, then you might be manipulating the citizens of the EU. And so they are protecting the rights of us who are resident here as just like they would protect our physical bodies. So basically information about you is a part of your person. And so by that definition, that's why I'm not sure if that's been globally accepted or if there was a good standard of that out of human rights law. But I do know that in the European Union, it's considered that it is a part of your person. It is literally a part of your person, your data about you.
Jim, in New York, potentially, what might this do to Facebook? I mean, I was stunned a couple of hours ago when I found out Facebook makes 98.5% of its money purely and only from happy advertisers.
Yeah, well, you just nailed it. I mean, Facebook is effectively 100% advertising revenue, and this will be a significant harm. Now, I will say what you'll see Facebook do is they will move much more rapidly, I suspect, into e-commerce and making money and diversifying their revenue streams, in other ways other than simply advertising. So it will certainly hurt them. At the very worst, it will slow their growth. Potentially, it will actually cause their revenue to decline. So I think that's a really significant concern. But let's go back. Joanna said a really interesting thing about advertising and manipulation. If you believe that advertising is manipulation, which in some regards it is, then you're going to definitely believe that privacy is more of a right and that advertisers don't have necessarily the right to manipulate you without your consent. If you believe that advertising is a question of just surfacing things that are relevant, don't surface me advertisements for women's shoes because I don't buy women's shoes. It's just sort of common sense to say giving me advertisement for men's shoes is more likely to be effective. It's a better use of money and it's more relevant to me. That is an undeniably self-interested perspective, say from Facebook or somebody who makes their revenue from advertising. But it also, from just a general common sense perspective, makes a lot more sense to users as well.
Mark, here in Doha, staying with that idea of advertising as manipulation, your specialty, particularly in this region where you and I live, is disinformation in this region. Is there a corollary flip between manipulation and disinformation that we can identify or tag through the prism of privacy and advertising?
I think there's a certain element to this. I think what we have to be very wary of as time progresses is how certain actors, whether they're state actors or private actors, will increasingly use manipulative techniques hidden within advertising. So we've already seen, for example, certain entities using fake journalists to try and trick news websites into publishing false content. My concern is that social media companies are going to be using these actors are going to be using social media companies and platforms such as Facebook to actually initiate certain surreptitious political campaigns. We are seeing evidence of that happen already, and I think this is a huge problem. I still think there's issues about transparency, about who pays for certain adverts when it comes to Facebook. And I think in this regulatory environment, and this is something we have to bear in mind as well, is that within the Middle East, Facebook can still do really as they want. So there's an issue here of jurisdiction about advertising and whether it's political or otherwise that we need to pay attention to. We're not just talking about Northern Europe and the US here.
Joanna, can we go back to something you were talking about a couple of minutes ago when you were talking about the ecosystem? When Apple does this, there is a distinct sense that Apple will just press the button, it'll go live, and Facebook has to deal with it. But does Apple also have to change its app ecosystem? Because they make an astonishing amount of money out of their app development companies. The figures are compelling because if an app developing company makes less than $1 million of a turnover per year, they pay 15% to Apple. If they make a turnover of more than $1 million a year, that figure doubles, and 30% of that goes to Apple as pure profit for them.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to remember that there's something really, really weird going on here. I mean, the whole thing, I can't remember all the statistics anymore. There was like one of the VR companies that Facebook bought that was worth more than the entire National Basketball Association in America. It was like 14 guys and they hadn't got a product to market yet. So the amount of money we're talking about both may seem like a really high motivation, but don't forget the regulators are coming after these people, and maybe they've decided that rather than actually pay tax, which I don't know why they're fighting so hard not to pay tax, they'd rather throw some money under the bus and somehow keep some level of liberty. I feel like it's some kind of a weird battle for power between people that have too much time on their hands, But if I was hoping when Facebook was found guilty for some of the fraud that led to Brexit, that they would lose like 90% of their market cap. And had they done that, they would still have been a huge company, and they still could have done a lot of great programming and created really cool products. But you just cannot conceive how much money has gone to these companies in recent years.
Pardon me for interrupting you there, Joanna. Jim Anderson in New York. One gets the distinct feeling that Mark Zuckerberg has kind of half spat the dummy on this one already. But realistically, what else can Facebook do? They're just going to have to ride the wave and see what happens.
Well, I think you're seeing Facebook do exactly, what they can, which is a PR campaign, right? They're taking out newspaper advertisements and otherwise trying to get that message out about small businesses will be impacted. I think it's a tough hand for them to play. I mean, again, as we've been discussing, it's really hard to be perceived or in reality be against privacy because most people want that. So I think they're going to do the best to get that message out. And then, like you said, Apple just gets to flip the switch and Facebook has to deal with it. I think that's probably the next phase of Facebook's messaging will be, why is Apple the one that gets to flip the switch? And are we okay with Apple being able to decide? Right now, you're okay with them flipping that switch and saying privacy is important and we have to deal with it. What about next time Apple wants to flip that switch and maybe they want to make more money? They want to change that 15 or 30% to some other number, or they want to put some other sort of requirement in place that's maybe not so popular. I suspect you'll see Facebook and others start to talk about that as well, because Apple, shouldn't necessarily be the gatekeeper to, all these decisions either.
Mark, what does this tell us about how Apple perceive their customers and how Facebook perceive their users? I mean, to me, it seems it's almost as if Apple sees they've got a couple of cardboard cutouts at Apple Central, wherever they're based, and they see a cardboard cutout of a man or a woman with one device in their hand, and they perceive that as a very personal relationship between the device and the individual, whereas Facebook seems to view their client base as, a very big percentage of 7 billion people around the world, and those people are just widgets, part of a delivery system, the system delivering profits to Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to be sympathetic in many ways to either of these companies. I think Facebook do have a point because their software is obviously used by an incredibly large number of people. But then again, so is Apple's. But Apple is, you could argue, is more of an elitist product. So they do serve different audiences. But I don't think we should be taken in by Facebook trying to appeal to the everyman, defending small to medium-sized businesses. Yes, of course, this will have an impact on them, but I don't think Facebook's primary concern is this business or their profits. Facebook's primary concern is its own bottom line. And I think what's interesting about this debate is what we're seeing is two, or in many cases more than that, large companies go at it. The whole reason we're having this argument, or rather Facebook and Apple are having these arguments, is because there has been a historic failure to regulate. The fact that Facebook have managed to profit for years off accumulating people's data has led to this point. They've enjoyed a healthy exploitation of people's data, whereas Apple have a dominant market share. They own a lot of infrastructural possibilities that allow it to control people's devices and how they consume their data. And there's another aspect to that I think we need to mention is that Apple themselves could stand to benefit financially from not having people's data tracked, because this could diminish the amount of revenue brought to advertising through apps. It might force app makers to have a paid-for model, which would then benefit Apple financially. So there is an element of financial war going on here, not just Apple saying that they're concerned about people's privacy.
And if I can add on to that, to Mark's point, Peter, I'll say this is not a David and Goliath, right? Facebook and Apple are both huge, giant companies. The other two companies you mentioned at the beginning, but that stand to benefit from this are Google and Amazon, right? So you think about Google and Amazon have a remarkable amount of data about us as well. They get it in different ways, and they're not going to be affected by Apple's changes nearly to the degree that Facebook is. But that's another thing. Facebook, is going to be harmed. Google and Amazon implicitly are going to be helped. And of course, Apple is going to be helped itself, as Mark was just saying.
Joanna, is there maybe a bigger fight coming, not involving Google and Amazon per se, but involving the little guys? I mean, both Facebook and Apple maybe have this bigger fight because there is now this thing called the Coalition of App Fairness. And basically, the likes of Spotify and a company called Match Group. Match Group is the umbrella company that owns globally an awful lot of dating apps. Now, that's the ultimate form of advertising, I guess. But if you've got Spotify with all their quite freaky, scary algorithms getting into bed, no pun intended, with dating apps around the world to square up against Apple and Facebook, I mean, the topography of this system that we all engage in a year or two might be perhaps radically different?
Yeah, no, I really want to come back to some of the points that were just made about regulation. There isn't enough regulation in this sector. And there was just regulation announced in Europe, who has proved the strongest regulators of this sector, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. So while I agree that there's sort of some fratricide happening, a lot of this is about trying to shape and to be held for account. I really love this point about who gets to just decide. You know, Twitter decided, and I wasn't offended, but a lot of people were. Twitter decided to basically censor the president of a G7 country in the most recent election. You know, that and not to fully censor, but to even have that level of interference. Twitter, we're not even talking about Twitter, right? Where are they on this scape? You know, so I think it's a great thing. Just as the European Union is a great way to bring a bunch of small countries together, I would love to see a bunch of small companies come together so that the representation is not only of these giants. You know, Microsoft has got representation at the UN now, right? So that's great. They're actually providing some public services there. But we need to see that playing ground leveled out. But we also really, really need to see stronger regulatory measures taken. And so I absolutely see this as an effort to confuse the regulators in the European Commission. And I hope that we aren't confused.
Jim, would it be fair to say, however, that as far as these two behemoths that we're talking about, Apple and Facebook, now I'm not saying either of them corporately or manifestly through individuals when they're up there on the stage talking to politicians, I'm not saying either company lies. I'm not saying either company does anything that is explicitly or implicitly illegal. However, both companies do kind of occupy a gray area when it comes to antitrust legislation, particularly in the US and particularly in the EU. And to go back to the point that Joanna was making there, seems to me that whether it's European Commission politicians or senators and congressmen in the States, the politicians have been in a time warp here because they're always playing catch up 18 months or 2 years behind what the likes of Facebook and Apple are actually doing with their users.
Yeah, I think you're being generous on the timing. I'm not sure they're 18 to 24 months behind. They may be years behind. And that's a real problem. Regulation, I think we all are for responsible regulation. But there's two challenges with regulation. Number one, it's a very messy process. It's also very local, right? What happens in the EU is very different than what happens in the US, which is very different than what happens, say, in China, right? And so, you know, it also moves at a glacial pace compared to technology. So I think you're always going to see regulators trying to play catch up with this fast-moving technology. But antitrust, furthermore, we need new theories of antitrust. Historically, in the United States, it's all been about price. If what a company is doing is causing you to pay more for a service, then that might be considered antitrust. Well, how do you put that lens in front of a free product? I don't pay to use Facebook. So I think you're going to see some new theories around antitrust, probably beginning in the EU and then following along in the US to try to deal with these new types of technology companies. And Apple is very much in that mix. Apple is an incredibly dominant company, and that App Store we've been talking about, I think, has got some significant antitrust concerns as well. Okay,
Mark, coming back to you here in Doha, Facebook, their kind of go-to stance on this, either via their head of PR or via Zuckerberg himself, their go-to response to this over the past year or so when it comes to privacy, particularly pegged to your area of disinformation, has always been our users prefer targeted adverts. Zuckerberg has said that in Congress. I've spent 2 days trying to find empirical evidence that says if you're a Facebook user, you like getting targeted adverts. I can't find any. What's going on there?
Sometimes I think when Facebook talk about their own audience, they are probably creating the audience that they desire in order to use it. And it's no different from the PR stunt that we're seeing here of Facebook placing themselves as defenders of the small and medium-sized business. They are taken on this mantle themselves without being invited and are exploiting that in order to make them appear that they care about the kind of everyman, the small business owner. So I think it's a cynical marketing ploy. One thing I'd like to add, though, as well, and we've talked about, for example, GDPR and EU regulation. We have to remember as well that even in Europe, the big tech companies, Silicon Valley, are fighting back. And I think this is something that's also alarming. It's not just going to be a question of regulators slowly, for example, improving the regulation about data privacy. These companies are fighting back. We've seen recently a leaked document shows that Google and other tech companies are basically increasing their lobbying presence in Brussels in order to, for example, mitigate against these things like antitrust cases against Apple and other companies. So this is something we need to be very mindful of.
Joanna Bryson in Berlin, what's Facebook's end game here?
I don't know if they have an end game, except for, of course, that Zuckerberg really does want to have all 8 billion of us on one of his applications. I think that's just a point of personal pride. But I do think it's much more about a relative game, a concern about, it's a concern that doesn't even make sense. If you look at the GDPR, the big tech fought it tooth and nail. And then within 6 months, we're going, oh, wow, this is weird. We're actually making more money. It's like, yes, the EU is a trading bloc. We actually do things to make the digital economy better while also protecting our citizens, right? So I really, going back to a couple of things that people were saying, and to better answer your question earlier, yeah, there's like 500 million people in the EU. It's true that's not the whole planet. But if we got even that segment of customers to have their advertising a little bit more spread back out like it used to be over other kinds of journalism and things like that, I believe that the only evidence you're going to find of, and I'm glad you've been having that problem too. We are researching some of these market dominance things right now here at Hertie School. But that what they're probably their evidence is when they use the data they have, they get more clicks, and so they're happier. Okay. But whether customers actually are happier when they find that they've bought more stuff or been driven onto more sites, it's like, are they happier when they've smoked more cigarettes? Okay. I'm not sure.
Okay, last 15 seconds to you, Jim. Apple will not do a U-turn. Does that mean that Mr. Zuckerberg and Facebook just have to suck it up and work around it?
Yes, I think they do. They really don't have a choice, as we talked about earlier. Apple's going to flip that switch. Facebook can complain, and then they'll adapt, and they will.
Okay, we have to leave it there. The clock has beaten us, as usual, on Inside Story. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our guests, Jim Anderson, Joanna Bryson, and Mark Owen-Jones. And thank you, too, for your company. You can see the program again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page. Yes, we do have one. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle @AJ Inside Story from me, Peter Dobby, and everyone here on the team in Doha. Thanks for watching. We will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.